Helen Belcher is a trans woman. She began transition when she was an active member of a Christian church. The response to her gender reassignment shook her church. Helen's attempt to find a new church shook her faith. She found she was seen as an issue rather than as a person. Christians may have much to learn from her experience. David Hallam of City Road Methodist Church asked Helen how Christians can ensure trans people feel welcome in their congregations.
Very simply, David, the same way as you'd welcome anybody else. Trans people are people. And if you keep that at the centre of everything that you do, then you welcome trans people as you would welcome anyone else. Underpinning that question, I suspect, is a question of morality. Is a trans person, living in some kind of sinful state? Well, all the evidence is showing that trans is a medical condition. Various health organisations have registered it as such. Trans people didn't choose to be trans. They might choose what to do about it, but they don't choose to be trans. And so, if you could put it on the same level as, well, how would you welcome somebody who's diabetic or any other health condition? And so I would leave that sort of moral judgment at the door. Your call as a church is to welcome everybody.
Yeah, one of the problems that a church has, and absolutely every other organisation has, and one of the areas which is a real sticking point, is the issue of toilets. Could you give us some guidance about that?
Well, again, the law around toilets, because it generally boils down to law, public toilets are governed by public order offences, and they are protected by the Equality Act. So unless you have a very, very good reason, which needs to be done on an individual basis, to exclude anybody from the toilets of a particular gender, assigned to a particular gender, then you should just allow people to use the toilets which correspond with the gender that they're generally presenting as at the time. There's toilets and whole access to women's safe spaces has been highlighted very much over the last couple of years. And there's a whole load of misleading statistics and all this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, it's about somebody's dignity and somebody's safety. So if you're a trans person and trans woman and then being told, no, you can't go there, you must go into the gents. Firstly, is that trans person going to be safe in the gents? And secondly, what do you think that does to that trans woman? It basically says, we don't accept you for who you say you are. And the moment you do that, they're very, very unlikely to darken your doors again. So, so the law is basically, unless somebody is causing a breach of the peace or at risk of causing a breach of the peace, they should be allowed to go where they feel safest going.
Obviously, as a church, we would want to welcome all to us. You mentioned the issue of sin. I mean, people often quote a verse in Deuteronomy 20.
Easy for you to say.
verse 5, which says it's an abomination to the Lord for people to cross-dress in any way. How do you respond to that?
Okay, so there's two responses. The first one is it's also an abomination to eat shellfish. So anybody who's had a prawn cocktail recently, again, easy for me to say, well, it's the same thing. But secondly, also, you have to bear in mind that Deuteronomy, like every other book in the Bible, is translated into English from an original. And the scholars who've looked into what the language means in the original Hebrew actually make reference to particular types of garments. So the words being used actually refer, it's an abomination for a man to put on a woman's, and it's a particular piece of clothing which protects other clothes from hair oil. And the reason that people would do that is to avoid a level of military service which was expected from Jewish men at that time. So there's a whole context around that verse that means that actually just saying women's apparel or women's clothing is a real simplification of what it actually means, and you kind of miss the underlying message. But you then also have to balance that with Jesus saying, that love, he came to fulfill the law. Paul's writing that the New Testament, all the rules that Christ brought in about love, basically means that Gentiles don't need to fulfill the law. Moses' law. And then also you've got the verse which says that in Christ there is no male nor female. So the genders are equal there. And there is also, you need to bear in mind that Old Testament section is a subset of the Talmud. And in other parts of the Talmud, it actually makes clear reference to trans people in a way that actually, trans people are who they say they are, and we should just accept them for who they say they are. And you can sort of see a journey throughout the Bible from a kind of very legalistic condemnatory view where eunuchs, for example, were not allowed to go anywhere near the temple, through to a point where actually somebody who was a eunuch was converted to Christ as one of the stories in Acts. So it moves from a kind of complete exclusion to a complete inclusion. So there's a journey throughout the Bible as well.
Well, the interesting thing is you yourself have been on a journey. When I first met you, you told me that you've been an evangelical Christian as a teenager, but something went wrong somewhere. Your answer just now shows that you've obviously thought about the theological implications of being a trans person in some detail. Can you tell us what went wrong, what went differently to your life?
What went differently, yeah. Well, yeah, wrong is a subjective word. Yeah, my last answer was a bit rusty. I think 10 years ago I'd have given it a lot more fluently. Yes, I mean, I was a small group leader actually in an evangelical church with my wife. And then I hit a point where I could no longer function as a man, as the father of in the family, and stepped down from small group leadership. But it became apparent very quickly that the church leadership didn't actually want me to go to church as Helen. And I found that as a really brutal kick in the teeth. And so I stopped going to that church. So I decided, well, if I was going to call myself a Christian, I needed to think very carefully, research very carefully so that I could substantiate what I believed rather than having a church around me to kind of, well, go and talk to them. And I started asking myself all the questions that I'd not asked since I was 13. And fundamentally, I got to a point where I said, look, I don't know if God exists or not, but if God does exist, then he's going to understand, or it's going to understand, why I've made the decisions that I have. So it was a process of logic to try and sort of make sure I was happy with where I was. But also, we went through a process where my wife stayed in that church for a while and then left that church because people wouldn't come round to our house. And then we went to another church for a bit. And then when we were looking at possibly becoming members of that church, the church leadership then said, well, we need to discuss the whole issue of trans people with our membership. So it's so what about me? No, we need to cover the theology behind transness first, and though you can't have any input into that because you're not a member. And then my wife was invited with our two children to her parents' church week away. And I was working, so I didn't go, but we'd arranged that I would go for a day, and we clarified that with that church, and they said that was all fine. And then when I arrived, I found her in tears because they basically said, no, we don't want her here. She can't come here. And so everywhere I was going, I was treated as an issue rather than as a person. And I thought, well, if church is going to do that to me, then I don't want to have that pain in my life. So I cut it out. And I still go to church for family events, baptisms, weddings, funerals, and so on. My brother-in-law is a vicar. but I just can't rationalize that belief anymore. And I guess, I mean, I had a really interesting experience, I guess, after about 2 weeks after deciding, no, I was prepared not to call myself a Christian anymore, where I had what I could only term to be some kind of spiritual experience, where I suddenly felt very at one with the universe, and there was no God anywhere within it. So I'm aware I could be a very evangelical atheist if I wanted to be, but I don't want to be, because ultimately it's no longer that important to me whether there is a God or not.
So if I was to try and persuade you, A, to come to church, and B, to persuade you to become a Christian again, you would...
The coming to church, I always find that very difficult. When we went to the intermediate church, I would go along on Sunday mornings, and I guess inside I was... I don't know if you've ever seen the Who Framed Roger Rabbit film, where Roger Rabbit just runs around the walls of a room. And I felt very much like that. It was as much as I could do not to kind of scream and just kind of, this is formulaic, it's not right, it doesn't work. So I stopped going to that, but I enjoyed meeting people and discussing things. So actually going to church, I actually still find very difficult, because I find the idea, it seems to me, I mean, again, bear in mind my recent experiences have been Church of England rather than any other group. But there is a very big emphasis, I would suggest, on being unworthy and how Christ's sacrifice made us worthy. And that doesn't tie with what I feel anymore. I think we are very capable of doing immense good, but also immense damage to our environment, which is again why I don't really see where God fits into that. There are also all the sorts of moral questions around, if God is so great and wants benefits, why do all these horrible things happen? Why? I mean, the question which really did it for me was, if Adam brought death into the world, and I know it's allegorical, but this is the rationale which a lot of Christian thinking seems to be based on. If Adam brought sin and death into the world, then how do you account for all those creatures which died, and which we can clearly see the fossil record for, before that point? That seems to be an immense amount of prejudgment and predetermination going on. And those creatures could have done nothing to stop their death. They had no voice in that at all. And that to me didn't seem like a very fair or just thing to do.
Well, can I just say that if ever you're in Birmingham on a Sunday morning, you'd be very welcome at our church. And we'd be more than happy to discuss these issues over a cup of coffee afterwards. Okay?
Or a glass of coffee.
Glass of coffee, yes, sorry, that was a slip of the tongue. And can I just ask one other thing on a really very, very serious note, and that is that we're going to put this up on our Facebook page and it will be shared. And the fact that we as a church are having a conversation with a trans woman is something that we noticed. Some of the people who will be watching this will be people themselves who may well be struggling with their gender identity.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you've given us some ideas as to how we should act as a church. If somebody does say, yes, I'm struggling with my gender identity, what word of advice would you give to those people about their gender identity and how they struggle with it?
Okay, firstly, I would say don't look at it as a struggle. I think that's the first key thing. Look at it as a journey. And a lot of journey, I mean, the journey allegory tends to be that you start from point A, you go to point B, and your aim is to try and get there as quickly in the most direct fashion as possible. Well, that's not always the case. Look at it as a scenic tour. So you can start to sort of explore different things. Oh, that's an interesting beach down there. I wonder what's in this shopping street, the medieval shopping street. And you start to explore. And I would say don't necessarily feel you have to have a destination in mind, but that you take single steps and you see whether you're happy with that before you take the next single step. And at times it does feel a little bit as though you're on a kind of conveyor belt and that things are moving because you've done something. But you can always press that stop button. There are people around who you can talk to. There are a lot of support groups across the country. There are national groups that you can probably go and talk to. There is still healthcare available. The whole medical practice is much more geared up to helping trans people talk things through without any prejudgment as to whether any treatment's going to come on afterwards. But find people you can trust, people that you can be open with. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck by was when I was going through transition in the sort of early 2000s. All the media coverage was of people who were absolutely certain this is who they were, and there wasn't any doubt expressed anywhere. And I suddenly realized that that was a media portrayal which was very inaccurate, and that actually most trans people I knew at that time had big doubts. So, you know, as they were going through the journey of their pathway, was this the right thing for them? So doubts are fine. Questions are fine. You don't have to have all the answers. The problem is, and this comes back into the church setting, is that our society expects you to be able to argue everything from a point of completeness when you're still taking those first baby steps out and trying to understand things. So I can remember having a long discussion with my dad, looking at the ins and outs of feminist theory, and it's like, I haven't read any of this, and I don't believe you have, and you're asking me to defend things based on stereotypes, and I don't think that's exactly right. And people want to try and put you in a box which they feel comfortable with, rather than just accepting you in the box that you're presenting them with. So, you know, don't take no for an answer. Be sensitive to those around you. Don't expect them to fully understand everything. The other one for transitioners is generally when you talk to I mean, the very common one is, oh, my partner, my wife doesn't understand, my husband doesn't understand. And generally, it's shortly after you've dropped the entire bombshell. And I say, well, how long have you been processing this? Oh, for years and years, yeah. And how long have you given your partner? Oh, it's a couple of weeks. Yeah, so, and that questioning within you has gone on for years and years at a very core level. And suddenly you're expecting somebody else after a couple of weeks at second hand to have the full understanding and acceptance, and appreciate that everybody around you has their own journeys to go on.
Can I just ask that and ask personally, you mentioned your wife and you going to church, and you mentioned that you were a father. Where's the family now? Is your family?
They're here.
They're here. So your family is...
We had our 26th wedding anniversary a couple of days ago, 2 or 3 days ago. Both my kids are now in their 20s. One's at university, one's in full employment, which is nice in these times. We approached this very much that any issue was going to be a family issue. It wasn't going to be an individual's issue. So that helped an awful lot. I won't say it was easy. It really wasn't very easy. And people ask, well, how did you keep your marriage together? Well, a lot of that was actually down to my wife and not down to me. And she got counselling. She learned to treat each day as it came, that she didn't have to make any decisions today that she was going to necessarily have to stick to tomorrow. We were very open and honest with the kids about what was happening, when it was going to happen, and so on. You know, they coped. They coped brilliantly. There was a bullying problem at school. But again, we decided that bullying problem was going to be our problem as a family to deal with, rather than the child that it affected, dealing with it on their own. And I'm constantly told that our two are probably the best adjusted children people have ever met, and they have been for a long time. They've learned to accept people They've had all sorts of weird and wonderful people walking through our front door, and they've just learned to accept people for who they say they are. And my younger one is becoming a bit of a social warrior, so it'd be interesting to see how that comes out.
So, in fact, that's the phrase which I think sums up what you're saying, is that churches and families should always try to accept people as they are, not what they demand they should be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a good lesson, irrespective of whether somebody's trans or not. You talked about, the first black person in the church, well, and there were a succession of them. And I guess it's similar, people you just accept the people as they walk in through the door. That's your mission.
Helen Belcher, thank you very much for sharing this with you. And may I say just simply, God bless.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us online at City Road Methodist Church, Birmingham. If you'd like to know more about us, go to our website www.cityroad.org.uk or find us on Facebook and Twitter.